Well, I have a wonderful electronic invention I want you to see.
It looks something like this.
Moving on to rule number 6, which is balance. Now, balance can determine whether an image is pleasing to look at or uncomfortable. Balance is a technique that positions elements or objects in an image to achieve equal visual weight. If there are two objects within an image and they both capture your attention equally, then a well-balanced image is achieved. There are two sides to this rule that we're going to talk about, and the first is formal balance, and then we're going to look at informal balance. Knowing how to balance objects within your images can mean the difference between a professional looking shot and an amateur looking shot. One thing to be careful of is that using informal balance in your images can turn viewers away if it isn't used particularly well. So using it effectively is really key. This rule does kind of follow on from the rule of thirds, as by placing objects off-center can create asymmetry, which tends to be more appealing to viewers. Now, the only problem with relying on the rule of thirds is that you can end up with empty spaces within a picture that just makes it look bare. Depending on the image, sometimes this works, but sometimes you might need to balance it by including other objects to help fill that empty space. So let's talk about formal balance. So to make it easy, think of formal balance as symmetrical balance. We want to position the subject in the center of our images with equal visual interest on either side. And informal balance. This is a lot harder to define as there are so many different variations that can create informal balance. But simply, informal balance can be achieved by placing two objects on either side of an image. Now, one thing is the size doesn't necessarily matter. You can have a big object and a small object on either side, vice versa. You could have both big, both small. The size doesn't really matter, but by positioning two objects either side of that image just helps create that informal balance. Again, this doesn't always have to be physical objects, it could be colours or textures. So this is quite difficult to explain, so let's have a look at some examples. So we've seen this one before, but this is a really good example of formal balance. If we were to split this in half and mirror one half, we would end up with pretty much the same image. The trees are pretty much equal on either side. There's nothing grabbing your attention more on that side than there is that side, and vice versa. Okay, and now moving on to our next example. Here we have a tree positioned in the center of our image. That's then reflected in this nice calm lake, but it's positioned dead center in that image. What's interesting about this shot is that it does include the moon on the left-hand side. So this is slightly out of symmetrical balance, but again, it's a good example of how positioning that tree gives a good shot. If we were to crop this image and position the tree on the right-hand side with the moon on the left-hand side, that would be a good example of informal balance. So moving on to some other examples of informal balance, we've got this very tall skyscraper. This stands out from the rest of the city, but by including these taller mountains on the left-hand side, this just balances everything against this tall skyscraper. We've got equal visual interest on either side. And onto our final image, this is a really striking shot and a really good example of informal balance. If we were to split this image and mirror it, we'd end up with a completely different shot. But what we do have is two different coloured and textured patterns on either side. So we've got this strong blue and white waves on this left hand side, and we've got the strong orange beach on the right. This is a good example of informal balance because nothing on here really is taking our attention to the left or the right. They're both pretty balanced, but they're not symmetrical, so it isn't formal balance. Because they're different, that creates informal balance, but it creates a really strong eye-catching image. This is probably one of the hardest rules that we've spoken about, but just keep this in mind that formal balance is kind of symmetrical balance. So if you were to mirror that shot, is the same going to be either side? If it is, then you've achieved formal balance. In a strange kind of way, informal balance is similar, but you are using two different objects either side of the image, but they both want to be achieving visual equal interest. They don't want to be taking our eyes to the left or the right, away from the other side.